We are thinking about Pentecost, about the incredible gift of the Holy Spirit. And so in this time of worship, I'd love to share with you a passage from Acts, the 2nd chapter. In your bulletin, there's a little bit longer of a passage than I'll read to you now, but I'll invite you to come back to it and read more of that later as Peter begins his beautiful and powerful and life-changing sermon. But let me share with you just the first few verses of that passage from Acts 2. When the feast of Pentecost came, they were all together in one place. Without warning, there was a sound like a strong wind, gale force. No one could tell where it came from. It filled the whole building. Then, like a wildfire, the Holy Spirit spread through their ranks, and they started speaking in a number of different languages as the Spirit prompted them. There were many Jews staying in Jerusalem just then, devout pilgrims from all over the world. When they heard the sound, they came on the run. Then, when they heard one after another their own mother tongues being spoken, they were thunderstruck. They couldn't for the life of them figure out what was going on and kept saying, "Aren't these all Galileans? How come we're hearing them talk in our various mother tongues?" Parthians, Medes, and Elamites, visitors from Mesopotamia, Judea and Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt, and the parts of Libya belonging to Cyrene, immigrants from Rome, both Jews and proselytes, even Cretans and Arabs. They're speaking our languages, describing God's mighty works. Their heads were spinning. They couldn't make head or tail of any of it. They talked back and forth, confused. What's going on here? Others joked, they're drunk on cheap wine. Would you pray with me? Oh God, open our hearts and our minds to the presence, to the gift, and the power of your Holy Spirit. And as I share in these moments, I pray that you would speak through me, and if need be, in spite of me, so that your word alone would be heard. Amen. So all together in one place, the remaining disciples gathered in the name of Christ and not entirely sure what to do next. But after the resurrection and ascension of Jesus, one thing for sure is clear: nothing will ever be the same. And then comes the Holy Spirit, falling on them like a violent rushing wind. And the commotion of all of that draws a crowd which is immediately amazed at what they are hearing. And they're not amazed at the diversity of languages, because that's something that they are used to hearing in Jerusalem, but the miracle of the barrier of those languages being broken down as they begin to hear in their own mother tongues. These strangers and foreigners, the others, are sharing the glory of God, and they're hearing it in their own language. And it's such an odd moment that many of them begin to try to explain it away with drunkenness, to which Peter casually mentions, of course not, it's only 9 a.m. But I have to say, I find myself particularly drawn to the ways that this scene seems to mirror another familiar story, one that takes us all the way back to Genesis, the story of the Tower of Babel. In fact, I want to read that for you as well. And from Genesis 11, we see this story. All people on the earth had one language and the same words. When they traveled east, they found a valley in the land of Shinar and settled there. They said to each other, "Come, let's make bricks and bake them hard." They used bricks for stones and asphalt for mortar. They said, "Come, let's build for ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the sky. And let's make a name for ourselves so that we won't be dispersed over all the earth." Then the Lord came down to see the city and the tower that the humans built. And the Lord said, "There is now one people, and they all have one language. This is what they have begun to do. And now all that they plan to do will be possible for them. Come, let's go down and mix up their language there so they won't understand each other's language. Then the Lord dispersed them from there over all the earth, and they stopped building the city. Therefore it is named Babel, because there the Lord mixed up the language of all the earth, and from there the Lord dispersed them over all the earth. Can you imagine what that must have been like? To have experienced that. One moment you are speaking with someone, you are able to converse together, and because of that you are able to achieve things together, achieve so much together, and then the next, what they are saying to you is incoherent. And as you try to speak to them in turn, it is also just incoherent to them. It is without meaning. I mean, it's no wonder that today we still call that babbling. But this story from Genesis 11, it's not about showing off God's power. It's not an apologetic explanation of why and how God is behind a diversity of nations and languages. I mean, it may be those things too, sure, but primarily we need to hear this story as warning, as an understanding that we give power to divisiveness and confusion when we exalt ourselves over God. So let's back up a bit. The people that God confused and dispersed in this story, the story of the Tower of Babel, were not just casually hanging out, and they certainly weren't in a state of faithful anticipation like those that we left back in Jerusalem. They were excited about something else entirely, namely their own achievements. Look at what we can do. We can make bricks, and not just any bricks, but bricks that can support massive structures. And then with tremendous pride in what they were capable of, they decide to use their abilities not just to develop a city, but within that city to build a tower with its top in the sky. And look, I realize that may not sound like a big deal. In fact, in today's context, that sounds like maybe they just wanted to build something really tall. And if you've ever stood at the bottom of a skyscraper, or maybe stood at the top and looked down from one, the phrase, its top is in the sky, might come to mind to you just simply as an apt description. And in a relative sense, that's exactly, at least part of what they were doing. They were proclaiming that through their abilities, they were now capable of building something taller than anyone had done so ever before. But that's not all. It doesn't end there. Because for them, this wasn't just a progression of ingenuity, but a promotion of humanity. They weren't building a taller building as if it was an achievement unto itself, or even to worship God closer to heaven. They were building a taller building to remove their need for God. To be able to climb into the sky through this tower, because that's where they believed that they would in fact find heaven. To be able to ascend above the clouds through their own accomplishment would prove that they no longer needed God. That they no longer needed to submit to God. Why bother anyways when we can earn our own way? We can get our own things. We can in fact build our own way to paradise. So the message of the Tower of Babel is a warning. A warning to not rely on the tools of the world to replace God. That we cannot, or we should not, exalt ourselves and our own achievements in ways that discredit or shun the work of God. I'm not saying, and I don't think Genesis is saying, that there's anything wrong with tall buildings, that there's anything wrong with working through architecture or science or the arts to better ourselves. I mean, remember, Jesus commanded us to love God with all of our minds, but the intent matters. The purpose behind it matters. And those who decided to build a tower at Babel, their purpose was themselves, deciding that their own abilities were sufficient for all that they needed, that patience or reliance on God was weakness. So they began to build a tower. Not a monument to that kind of thinking, but literally an apparatus to remove their need for God. Now, probably somewhere between none and a very few of you are making bricks for a tower that you believe will somehow help you surpass God or remove your need for God these days. So I don't imagine any of us have a literal Tower of Babel coming together, but we all have our towers of Babel. Projects or attitudes or relationships that subtly move us to think, believe, or even begin to declare that we don't need God. Where we begin to rely on our own abilities and the standards of the world. And in fact, the danger might be that because our modern, internal, figurative towers are much more subtle these days, that until we are willing to allow ourselves to really be challenged by God, our towers might continue to grow and grow. I mean, they won't actually get us anywhere with God unless further from God counts. But we continue to live into the confusion and the scattering of those Genesis 11 builders. And then comes the Holy Spirit. On that day, nearly 2,000 years ago, the Holy Spirit fell on a very different group of people. A group that was faithful, that was waiting for God's command. And as we see throughout the book of Acts, as it continues, a people who was ready to be challenged in ways that they couldn't even imagine, so that their work would be the very work that God used to turn the world upside down. They weren't building a tower to God or to replace God. They were waiting on God, relying on God. And the blessing they received was the very life-changing presence of God. And that day, the day of Pentecost, my friends, that was the moment, not just when the church was born, but when the reversal of the Tower of Babel began. The barriers of language that kept them apart were overcome by the Holy Spirit. It's nothing less than a miracle, and it's one that we are invited to still experience today. Because the Holy Spirit is still with us today, still changing lives today, still turning the world upside down today. It's the presence of God that we know and grace that we lean on to be formed into disciples and into the church that prays on our behalf. The Holy Spirit continues to envelop us, guide us, empower us to break down barriers and set us free, even barriers that we have created. The Holy Spirit came to continue the work of Jesus throughout all the world, to enable for us the life abundant and eternal that has been promised to us through Christ. But our posture matters. God interacted very differently with two types of very different people. One sought to bend God to their will. The other sought God's will. One decided their own powers would suffice. The other humbly waited for God's. And one found itself defeated, confused, and scattered, while the other found itself inspired, changed, and forming a movement that continues today as the Christian church. So, when the Holy Spirit comes to you, what will it find? Amen.